The next argument that seeks to establish the existence of God is commonly referred to as the cosmological argument or the first cause argument. And this argument actually has a history dating back to ancient Greek philosophy, dating back to a period prior to Christianity, and its origins are generally attributed to the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Now, Aristotle wasn't thinking about gods at all. Aristotle was interested in the origins and causal functioning of the universe. And in particular, he was interested in motion. And so he was trying to understand how it was that motion could ever have come to be. Given that things are in motion, how can we explain them? And his idea here was that, well, the way that we explain motions is by saying that something is put into motion by being hit or pushed by something else. And the motion from the first thing gets transferred to the second thing. And that is, in fact, a form of causality. Aristotle then said, well, but what about the motion for that second thing? Well, that would have to have been brought about by something else, imparting its motion to it. And so now we have a third moving thing, and so on, and so on, and so on. Every time we explain the motion of an object by appealing to some other object, transferring its motion, we now have to explain the motion of that object. And so, inevitably, that line of explanation will just stretch out infinitely. There'll never be an end to that explanation, because any given step in our explanation is appealing to an object that has motion, and hence calls for an explanation for that object's motion, and hence takes us a step farther down the line. Aristotle's solution to this was to posit the existence of an unmoved mover, a thing that was in motion, and hence could transfer its motion, but that itself didn't have a cause for why it was in motion. And this argument, which was about the physical world, understanding actions in the physical world, it got translated into religious thinking about the nature and existence of God, both by Christianity and by Islam. And in fact, the first adaptation of this argument for philosophy of religion was probably introduced by this gentleman here, whose name I definitely won't be able to pronounce correctly, Avicenna or Ibn Sina. And he was an Islamic scholar who lived from about 980 to 1037 CE. And he's generally thought to be the first person to adapt this kind of argument to try and establish the existence of a monotheistic worshipful deity. The argument itself is a little bit complex, so we want to make sure we understand the argument before we turn in the next module to criticisms of the argument. So the argument starts off by just observing, look, the universe is constantly changing. So just as Aristotle observed, look, things are in motion, this argument starts off, look, things are changing. The second premise says, look, every time something changes, every time we see an effect that requires the existence prior to that in time of something that brought about that change, a cause. And that cause had to have been sufficient to bring about that change. So this premise, sometimes referred to as the principle of sufficient reason, is very much like Aristotle's premise. In order for something to move, it has to have a motion transferred to it by some other object that is moving. And that object can only transfer the motion that it has. It can't transfer more. So for it to move something very fast, it has to be moving at a sufficient speed. The same thing here, just stated generally about causality. Change requires the existence, prior to that change, of a cause. That cause has to be sufficient to bring about the change. So now we've got these two premises, and these premises are a posteriori premises about the nature of the world and the nature of causation. Our third line in this argument draws a conclusion from the relationship between these two premises. It says, hence, no change causes itself. And it gives us a reason. A change can't cause itself because the cause of a change, the cause of an effect, has to exist prior to the effect, prior to the change that's brought about. And therefore, effect can't cause itself, a change can't cause itself because it hasn't come into existence prior to being caused, prior to being brought into existence. And so we have now these three principles. There's change in the world. Every change requires the supposition of a cause. That cause can't be the same thing as the change itself, and it has to exist prior to the change that we're trying to explain. All of these points lead us to this fourth line here. And the fourth line says, look, to explain the current state of the universe, to explain the changes that we observe in this moment, we're going to have to posit an infinite number of causes, since each prior cause would also have to have a cause, just as each motion had to have an object that was in motion prior to it that would transfer that motion. Each cause, or each effect rather, has to have a cause prior to it. The positing of that cause then requires us to posit a cause for it, and so on, and so on, and so on. And so, again, we have this infinite regress of causal explanation that Aristotle had when he was trying to explain motion. Now it's a general regressive explanation. So what are we going to do? We feel that we have these observations about the state of the world. We feel that they can be explained or should be explained by positing causes. But now we see that way of understanding the current state of the world by positing a cause, then a cause of that cause, then another cause of that cause, and so on. That's going to lead us to an infinite series. And we realize now that that can't possibly explain the current state of the world. And that's what line C5 is about. Line C5 says, look, if we're trying to explain the current state of the world through an infinite number of causal events, then we would have to suppose that an infinite series of causal events occurred prior to the current state of the world. The problem with that is infinite is infinite. There isn't a beginning and there isn't an end for something that is infinite. And so we would have to exhaust an infinity, which is conceptually incoherent, of previous causes in order to get to our current effect, our current state of the world. And so we seem to have this contradiction that arises because of the way that we think we ought to explain the nature of the current state of the universe. And line 6 just then says, look, there has to be some way out of this problem. If in fact there is a contradiction in our explanations, when we suppose that no thing can cause itself, then there must be something that causes itself. There must be an uncaused cause, just as Aristotle posited an unmoved mover. And then the argument ends by equating that uncaused cause with a monotheistic worshipful deity. Therefore, God, the uncaused cause, exists. So there's our argument. It's a religious adaptation of an argument about the nature of causality that dates all the way back to hundreds of years BCE. In the next module, we'll look at what people make of that argument, whether or not it seems to establish the existence of a monotheistic worshipful deity.